study. Time starts. Start with a couple of lame overviews. The first is on scope. We notice that if we win our case, as long as we win our case, we still outweigh even if they win theirs, because we tell you that a global recession ultimately impacts every single person on this world, while they're only impacting a couple percentile of the US population. But even if you don't buy that, I would argue you always weigh death, avoiding poverty, over avoiding fixing domestic abuse because of reversibility. This is because we can fix domestic abuse, but when somebody dies because they're impoverished, that you can never take that back. The life has already been lost. But third weighing is because it is hard to measure, because this is a deep-rooted structural problem, as they tell you, which means it is a multifaceted problem, which means it's very hard to solve. And if UBI, just one thing can solve it, I don't understand why something else hasn't solved it before. But let's go on to the specifics. The first contention they talk about is about intimate partner violence. I would argue that our case prerequisites theirs, which means you have to consider ours first, because they tell you the root cause that they're coming back 85% of the time is because of their financial instability. However, if you push 900 million people into poverty worldwide, doesn't that mean that 900 million more people will become more reliant on their abusers? But even if you don't buy that, I would argue you can delink this argument in a couple of ways. Because first, this UBI would not be enough money, because we tell you it would be around $1,000 a month. That is literally just enough to get you food, shelter, and water to survive, and that's not enough to actually make you self-dependent. But even so, I would argue that UBI is not the only way we can fix this. We can fix this through counseling services, education programs, other things like that. They don't prove the uniqueness of UBI, why UBI is literally the only thing we can use to solve this problem. But a couple more responses. I would argue that they're not solving for it anyways, because domestic violence is super complicated, like I said. There's other factors that impact it, like the psychological factors. They're solving for one facet in a multifaceted problem. But even so, abusers also have financial control, as they tell you in their case. This means that even if you give a UBI, a lot of these people that are being abused still share a bank account, or will literally get their checks taken away by these abusers. If they're abusing them with means-tested welfare, I really don't see why these UBI is that different. But even so, I would argue you can turn it, because means-tested welfare can provide house vouchers for these women, which means that actually it gives them a place to live that's not with their abusers. Let's go on to a couple of line-by-line things. They say this 41.4% domestic violence rate. Read the card, it actually says 8 to 41, so it could be anywhere from there, which means you can mitigate their impact. Let's go on to their Kenya. They don't prove why Kenya is comparable. Who knows? There's a bunch of other factors that make it so that Kenya is not completely the same as the US, and insofar as they don't prove that it is comparable, you can't buy that evidence. But let's go on to their second contention about racial oppression. First, you can delink their argument, because actually African Americans represent the majority of recipients. As Divine 2018 tells you that actually Black Americans made up 29.1% of all recipients, while whites only made up 27.6%, which means you can delink their argument. But even so, I would argue that this is also a deeply integrated problem that we've been facing for hundreds of years. I don't see why UBI suddenly solves for all of that. Then, onto their cards. The first card that they tell you about is how states with a majority of Black population were more restrictive. Call their card, it never says a single sentence about that. But even so, they tell you that requirements punish Black people and exempt white people. However, they tell you there's exemptions, but we have no clue what these exemptions are. We don't know what their implications are. We don't know what they actually mean, so we really don't know what's going on here. But then, onto their impact about happiness. I would argue that we solve for that if we solve for poverty too, because the people in poverty are inherently sad too, because it's harder for them to get by as well. But even so, they give you this 60,000 card die due to inequality, but that's not only because of means-tested welfare. We don't know how much of the problem means-tested welfare actually causes. But then, onto our case. They talk about how there was $4 trillion of new money injected in the 08 recession, but the 08 recession, we were literally at an all-time low. They can't compare circumstances for them. Thus, we